Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Newt Gingrich's lecture on facing America's greatest threat. Without further ado, please welcome Newt Gingrich.
Thank you all very much. I'm delighted to be here and have a chance to talk about some ideas. And I want to start, though, by thanking Young Americans Foundation, and particularly the president, Max Brandon, the treasurer, Grayson Adler. I also want to thank the USC trustees who helped organize the event, in particular Michael Adler and his wife, Jill. So I'm delighted to be here. And I'm going to talk about what's happening in China, why I think China is our greatest threat. And then we're going to toss it open for questions, and I think they're going to have a microphone over there somewhere, so anybody who wants to can ask questions. Let me start and say that I would not have given this talk 10 years ago. 10 years ago, I was still part of sort of the national consensus that had evolved, that China was going to become more and more Western, more open, more democratic. Gradually, I began to realize that, in fact, the differences were dramatically greater than we were crediting ourselves with, and that the consequences were greater. And so the more I looked into it, the more I thought about it, the more I began to realize that, in fact, there was a tremendous momentum of Chinese effort underway to once again become the Middle Kingdom, which is not irrational. China was, from the origins under the Yellow Emperor about 5,000 years ago, up through about 1800, the most populous, the wealthiest, the most civilized system in the world. And if you go back and look at Marco Polo's visit, for example, the number of things he took back to Europe that were literally generations ahead of anything the Europeans had even dreamed of. So it was an enormous shock around 1800 when Western military technologies began to surpass the Chinese by such a big margin that China found itself virtually helpless in trying to stop the Europeans and then the Japanese after they modernized with the Meiji Restoration in 1868. And the result was that China went through a period which was just an enormous shock, which they refer to as the century of humiliation. It actually ran a little bit longer than 100 years. But in their worldview, it really ended only in 1949 when the People's Republic of China was founded by Mao in Beijing at the end of the Chinese Civil War, which had been going on really from the founding of the Chinese Communist Party in the 1920s, and its major competitor, the Kuomintang, which ironically was also a Soviet-trained system. So the Kuomintang had very much the same model as the Communist Party of China. They were both basically Leninist systems. The Soviets in the early days actually financed and supported the Kuomintang much more than they did the communists. They didn't think the communists were serious and didn't think they were a very good investment. But gradually over time, the Kuomintang failed. So the result was there's a natural underlying sense of legitimacy. I mean, if we have the concept of Make America Great again with Trump, they have the China dream with Xi Jinping, and so they have a sense of the future they want. Well, there were two very simple human things that were kind of the beginning of getting me to think differently. And I'd been reading about China since 1960 and studying it, and my dad fought in the Korean War, so I had a very real interest in their role, for example, in the extraordinary Thanksgiving offensive of 1950, which is one of the great military achievements of the 20th century. And I was visiting China with Callista I think it's about 2005 or 6. And we went to a place in Beijing called the Pearl Palace. And the Pearl Palace is really a market. And it's a tourist trap. It's about 8 stories tall, and the first couple floors are pearls. But when you get up around the 6th floor, they sold pajamas. And my 2 grandchildren were very young at the time. And I thought, I'd like to buy them pajamas. It'd be kind of a neat thing for Grandpa to bring back Chinese pajamas. And so I happened to have with me two people who'd served on the National Security Council staff who were both fluent in Chinese and who both had gone to the University of Beijing. And they were my coaches. And they said, okay, tell the lady who runs the store what you want. She will give you a price. Whatever price she gives you, offer her 10%. Now, I'm an American. I go into Walmart, it says $19.95. I don't take it up to the counter and say, I'm thinking 14, what do you think? You know, in our system, there's remarkably little bargaining, except maybe for houses and cars. But as a general rule, there's an amazing range of things, you know, we just pay for. And if you don't want to buy it, don't buy it. So I said, I really would love these. And she said, well, 200 yuan renminbi. And I said, following the advice, I said, 20. She stared at me, and then she began talking very intensely. And they said to me, she's now telling you that you are going to bankrupt her firm, leave her children starving, and she doesn't know how she can go home tonight at the price you're talking about. But be patient, because she'll give you a new lower number. And she came back at something like 180. And they said, okay, go up 5. So I went, 25. This is the end of her family. She can't believe that a rich American would do this to a poor Chinese person. Well, we do this for 40 minutes. And she's having a great time. I mean, she is just, you know, she's just lambing right into me. And then I'm standing there like an idiot listening to these two clowns give me advice. And finally, I settle at 50. Now, she started at 200, so you might have thought, what a deal. These two guys are saying to me, she made money at 30. You didn't have to go above 30. She'd eventually been worn out. Now, here's what I learned, and I want you to think about this very deeply. She liked bargaining. She thought it was fine. The U.S. trade representative walks into a room to get a deal. The Chinese trade representative walks into a room to talk. If a deal occurs, that's fine. But if a deal doesn't occur, that's okay. Our guy, our man or woman comes out nervous. We didn't get it worked out, but maybe next week. They walk out thinking, well, that was kind of fun. Let's go have a drink. Second example that really began to get me to think that this is different. They're not mirror images of us. They really come from a very different model. A very good friend of mine in Minneapolis did a leveraged buyout of the second largest battery company in the United States. Made huge batteries for nuclear submarines. They made regular batteries and were the chief supplier to Walmart. And he had decided very early in the opening up of China that he wanted to put a battery factory in China. So he's going in what is still really pioneering. And he meets with the Minister of Industry, and they start negotiating about what's the deal, how are you going to work out ownership rights, et cetera. And he would say something in English, the interpreter would translate it into Mandarin, the minister would think about it, he would then answer in Mandarin, the interpreter would put it back into English. This went on for 3 years. At the end of 3 years, they finally get a deal. And so they have a celebration. And they're at this very fancy dinner celebrating. And after a little while, the minister, who's sitting right across the table, looks at him and says, how about them golden gophers? He goes, what? He said, I went to the University of Minnesota. I was the ball boy for the football team. He speaks totally fluent English. And for 3 years, as long as they were negotiating, he pretended he didn't speak English, so he had the extra time to think during the translation process. Now, that is so implausible. We can't imagine an American doing this because it violates our concept of speed and efficiency. So I began to think to myself, there were patterns and there were habits I wasn't getting. And I read Sun Tzu's The Art of War probably around 1960 or 61. I'd studied Mao all during the 60s to understand the Vietnam War. And I had a general sense of the system. But I had this thought, as did most of our leadership, that they were beginning to change. And that thought in part came from a tour made in 1992 by Deng Xiaoping, who was then the leader of the system, who went on what's called the Southern Tour, because he was in southern China. It's not very complicated. And he said, we have to fundamentally change our economy, and we have to move towards a market-oriented economy. And he coined a very famous phrase. He said, I don't care if it's a black cat or a white cat, I care if it catches mice. And in fact, in Nanjing, which I went to, there's this huge bridge with two 30-foot tall cats, one black and one white. Now, what he was saying was, don't tell me communist theory, don't tell me capitalist theory. Are you able to grow the economy? Are you able to build factories? Are you able to do things or not? So a lot of us looked at that. We watched them open up, and he literally reached out to the Chinese diaspora and brought a whole number of millionaires from all around the world who were Chinese back to advise them, to say to them, this is what you have to do. If you really want to grow the economy, here's what you have to do. And so they were really making dramatic changes in the economy, and of course it's worked. It was an enormous success. It is impossible to look at the last 40 years of Chinese history and not think that it is one of the great achievements. The number of people they brought out of poverty into middle-class status is absolutely astounding. And this is a country which has 43 cities bigger than Chicago. So, I mean, you're moving a lot of people. And a lot of us thought, okay, this is terrific because it's the first step. Then they're going to open up politically. And we were wrong. And we totally misunderstood what he was doing. He's a very clever man. He's about this tall. And he came to the U.S. There's a great picture of him at a rodeo, I think in Wyoming, with a cowboy hat on. And he's signaling, how can you think I'm harmful? I couldn't possibly be dangerous. I'm just a silly guy in a big cowboy hat. And he communicated this whole sense of the new China is not a threat, and we can really get along together. And then we began to realize that that's not exactly what he had said. What he said was, in order for the dictatorship to survive, people have to be prosperous enough not to throw us out. So he was opening up markets for the purpose of creating wealth to strengthen the dictatorship. And then I began looking into his background. Well, I felt like an idiot because for years I had the wrong idea. Deng Xiaoping in the early 1920s is one of the early founders of the Chinese Communist Party. He goes to Moscow and spends a year at Lenin University studying how to create a Leninist totalitarian system. He believed in it totally. And Deng Xiaoping, Mao Zedong, Judah, and Zhou Enlai loved Stalin. And they thought of Stalin as the great leader. And they all read Stalin's short history of the Bolshevik Revolution, which I'm sure you can get in the library here, or you can order from Amazon, and which is one of the most difficult books to read I've ever tried. I owned a copy, and I got through about page 90. It's a 600 page. This is a short history. It's 600 pages. Actually, I think it's called a brief history. And it is written in it's written in bad Russian by a guy from Georgia who's a bank robber. But it has this whole model of how to run a totalitarian system. And they loved it. And it turned out when Khrushchev gave his famous secret speech in 1956, in which he denounced Stalin, they were all shocked. They thought of Khrushchev as a heretic. He was violating the great Stalin. Furthermore, they watched that speech lead to a rebellion in Hungary, rebellion in Poland, rebellion in Czechoslovakia, and the lesson they drew was you get soft, you lose control. Well, 30 years later, they watched Gorbachev. And Gorbachev went through perestroika and glasnost, and guess what? The Soviet Union disappeared. So their attitude is, weakness will end our dictatorship. So when in doubt, kill somebody, or at least lock them up for a while. And so they were actually modernizing the dictatorship when we thought they were trying to make a transition. Now, let me give you just a couple examples that are very simple. If we could get the news media and the government, and for that matter, your professors, to simply say the following: Xi Jinping is the General Secretary of the Communist Party, which has 90 million members. Trump got 63 million votes. He is the chairman of the Military Commission, which supervises the People's Liberation Army. The People's Liberation Army is the army of the Communist Party. It's not a government army. And, by the way, he's the president of the People's Republic of China. Now, the Chinese will never cite him that way, because the Chinese have very cleverly decided to normalize him. So he's always President Xi Jinping, because they want us to think he's just like, the president of France, or you name it, just another typical government leader. But he's not. And the Chinese Communist Party is today a Leninist totalitarian system. Now you may say, why do I say that? Well, let me give you a couple examples. And I read this one interview with Mayor Bloomberg about 3 weeks ago where he said, it's really not a dictatorship. They really have to have the support of the people, so it's not fair to call them a dictatorship. And I have no idea why he said this. I mean, Bloomberg makes a lot of money in China, but this was sort of pathetic. So a couple examples. There are over 1 million Uyghurs currently in concentration camps in Western China. These are Muslims. I saw a senior Chinese leader while preparing the book, and I said, look, I want to be fair. What's your side of the story? Why are there over 1 million people in concentration camps? And with a totally straight face, he said to me, you shouldn't think of them as concentration camps. Think of them as boarding schools. Now, these are boarding schools with machine guns. He said, we're trying to educate the Uyghurs to be good Chinese. So we're doing them a favor. In Tibet, they're trying to destroy the Tibetan Buddhist culture and destroy the monks. There's a breathing society, which is a misnomer, but is the way it's normally referred to, the Falun Gong. At one time, there were very senior Chinese leaders who belonged to Falun Gong. But Falun Gong was a mortal threat to the system because the number one characteristic of Falun Gong is it teaches honesty. And if you're in a totalitarian state, what matters is what the state tells you, not what honesty tells you. So they have literally for over a decade been hunting down and killing the Falun Gong, including killing them for organs that they could use for transplants. And it's an endless war. And for some reason, Falun Gong, which is a sort of secular religion, it's more than we describe as a breathing society, but really it is a way of life which purifies you and gives you a deeper sense of being. It keeps spreading despite the fact that they're getting killed. So there are millions of Chinese who practice Falun Gong. And the Chinese government's out hunting them down every day. We did a podcast. I do a podcast every Sunday that you can get for free. And we did one about 3 weeks ago with a professor at Hunter College who's Chinese, who was disappeared. He's walking down the street. The police walk up to him. They say, hi, you're coming with us. They don't tell his family. They don't tell his lawyer. And he disappears. And after a while, they say, now, if you're willing to make a videotape of that you're guilty, we'll release you. So he made a videotape that he was guilty. They released him. He promptly got his family out of China smuggled them out, took a job in Hong Kong, got an invitation to Harvard to give a lecture, and never went back. They're all in New York now. And to show you how this works, the highest paid actress in the world is Chinese. Earlier this year, they disappeared her for months. Now, this is, again, think Hollywood. I mean, everybody knew she was gone. And the police just had her. They wouldn't talk to anybody, wouldn't tell you where she was, wouldn't tell you what the charges were. Finally, after a couple months, she made a video that she'd done some things wrong, and it was totally correct of the state to be correcting her, and they released her. But they had a deeper meaning. They were saying to everybody in China, if we can disappear the highest paid actress in the world, you can't imagine what we can do to you. And then, of course, you get Hong Kong, where they really have a huge problem now. And Hong Kong is a very complicated difficulty. I ran in a couple weeks ago at the Vatican to the former High Commissioner at Hong Kong, who actually had managed the transition. And he had briefed me about 1994 when he was in charge. And the truth is, the British ran Hong Kong as a colony, okay? I mean, all this current talk about freedom and elections and all that stuff, that was not exactly the British model until it was about time to get rid of Hong Kong, at which point they suddenly really wanted to import democracy to sort of leave the Chinese with a huge headache. Well, it's now stuck, and the Chinese have a double problem. First of all, there are a substantial number of people in Hong Kong who are not Chinese. There are a large number of Vietnamese who have deep hostility towards China. There are a significant number of Filipinos. There are about 80,000 Americans. And so there are a lot of different people there who don't automatically get up in the morning and share Xi Jinping's China dream. Second, they actually like the rule of law. They like the stability. They like being part of the world market. They like being really wealthy. There are more millionaires in Hong Kong per capita than any other place in the world. And they have a pretty good understanding that if they get sucked into the Chinese judicial system, that a lot of that's going to disappear and they're going to be 40 or 50% poorer in a couple of years. So there's enormous tension. And the challenge for Xi Jinping is he can't allow them to defy Beijing too openly, because that could be a signal to other places, if they can do it, we can do it. And China has a history every once in a while of just blowing apart. The Taiping Rebellion in the 1860s killed about 75 million people. So it can be very volatile very fast. And so they want to keep the lid on. On the other hand, Hong Kong is so public, has so much press coverage, has so many people used to going there, that it's very difficult, and it's a big city. Big cities are very hard to occupy. They absorb troops. And so they don't particularly want to try to send enough troops into Hong Kong to pacify it. And if they send too few troops in, then you get into what happened in Hungary and in other places where all of a sudden you have people, dropping Molotov cocktails out of their building or dropping a large brick dropped from the 80th floor is going really fast by the time it hits you. And so they really have a hard challenge, and I don't think they've solved it. Their goal, I think, was to try to pick out the leaders. That's why they went through a period where they were spraying water that had a blue code on it so that they could identify who you were, because they sprayed you with this blue paint. The problem was there are a couple million people who are in rebellion. So, you say, we'll get these 30 guys or the men and women, and we'll arrest them. Well, that's fine. There are another 30 standing there waiting to step up. And so they really have a level of turmoil that they don't quite know how to deal with. But it's clearly not the behavior of a free society. And I think people in Hong Kong have a pretty good idea that Bloomberg may not realize it's a dictatorship. They do, and they don't want any part of it. So that's about China internally. By itself, that doesn't necessarily have to bother us. We live on a planet where there are a number of places that have really miserable governments. Think Venezuela, Cuba, Nicaragua. There are a lot of places that have really sad things that we wish would be better. What makes China different is that the economic strategy of Deng Xiaoping has worked, and they now have an enormous level of wealth, which enables them to be competitive in ways that were not true 40 or 50 years ago. When Kissinger and Nixon went to China, it made perfect sense for us to try to get the Chinese to be our ally, because we were pitting them against the Soviet Union. And therefore, they were a relatively weak country. They were no great immediate threat to us. And as part of the end state of the Cold War, they played a significant role. And so and Kissinger wrote a very good book called On China, particularly the first half of it, which is the memoir and the experiences of his being in China during this very opening up formative period. Now they're in a different position. Now they are, by any reasonable standard, the second most powerful country in the world, the second most powerful economy in the world, and they're very rational, smart people. Their leadership tends to be engineers. They think in very practical ways. And they have a grand strategy, and the grand strategy is very patient. One of the things we did, and I recommend this to all of you if you've never done it, how many of you have ever played Go? Let me just, a couple have raise your hand, I'm curious. Just let me, a couple up here, that person. Okay. We actually, Kissinger refers to this in his book and says that Go is a game. It was originally invented in Japan and then became really popular in China. And has been played for a very long time. And it's sort of their parallel to chess, except it's radically different. And so we got the National Go headquarters in Arlington, Virginia to come over one night. And by offering them pizza and beer, we convinced them that they should spend an evening teaching us the basics just to get into the rhythm. This started when a lieutenant colonel at the Army War College wrote a paper saying, we don't understand the rhythm and pattern that the Chinese plan with. And so we keep trying to think that they behave like we do. And he cited Go and why it mattered. There are two really big differences between Go and chess. The first is Go is about the acquisition of territory, not killing your opponent. So if I can occupy most of the board and you're still alive, I don't care. I won. And so it teaches you to think constantly about how do I maneuver in order to maximize control of the board. The second is it teaches you to look at the entire board before every move and ask, what am I missing? You know, what opportunities are there that I didn't see? What threats are there that I didn't see? Now, I would argue that if you play Go even a little bit, you understand the South China Sea strategy perfectly. Because what they've done in the South China Sea, starting before the communists, in 1934 or 35, the Kuomintang, which was then the official government of China, issued a map. And the map has this dotted line that is most of the South China Sea. And the claim they were making, the opposite of Western law, we talk about freedom of the sea. They're saying, no, all of this ocean is Chinese. Now, this matters because 1/3 of all the commercial shipping in the world goes through the South China Sea, and there are huge oil and gas deposits. And they were laying a claim to an area that's about half the size of China. After 1949, when the communists were in charge, they took up the same map. They dropped one line on the map in order to appease the Vietnamese. And they had to have this map that shows you the South China Sea. And then they said, you know, we think it would be helpful to occupy some of the islands. And so they went out to a couple of places in the South China Sea that have very small islands, and they began to occupy them. They got into a couple of skirmishes with both the Vietnamese and the Filipinos, both of whom had to back off because they're just not big enough to compete with China. They developed an entire fishing fleet that is about 5 times the size of the fisheries. You literally could not fish. As many fish as they could take would be impossible. You'd destroy all fishing in the South China Sea. But what they are is they're a National Guard. So they now have several hundred fishing boats. Which means one of these days, you're going to see an American ship surrounded by about 15 Chinese fishing boats, several of which will have school students who are on a summer program who happen to be there, totally innocently. Now, there's no possible video of an American warship hitting a fishing boat that isn't a disaster. And they're just going to start gradually crowding us out and saying, you know, this is our sea, this is not your sea. So the next stage after they took the islands, they said, you know, there aren't enough islands. They began building islands. And they would say, this is just, look, it's perfectly legal. We're building a little island here. Don't worry about it. It's totally peaceful. Oh, by the way, we're putting an airfield in. Oh, yeah, and by the way, there'll be a port. Oh, and yeah, last week we put in anti-aircraft missiles. Next week we're going to put in some anti-ship missiles. But it's really, we're never going to use them. It's totally peaceful. You don't have to worry about it. What they're doing is they're building a series of barriers that push the American fleet from the Chinese coast 400 or 500 miles away from China. And we would find it very hard to fight our way in past all these islands. And it's classically how the Chinese operate, systematically, methodically. Now, where it gets to be an even bigger game is what they call their Belt and Road Initiative, which essentially is, we're going to go out and spend a lot of money on infrastructure around the world, but we're going to knit it together under the same brand. So they have 46 different port projects in Africa, 46. They have a port project on both the Atlantic and Pacific side of the Panama Canal. They have, my wife is the ambassador to the Vatican, so we live in Rome right now. So Xi Jinping comes to Rome, and they sign an agreement. The Chinese are now going to manage Genoa, which is the largest port in Italy, and they're going to manage Trieste, which is the largest port in the Adriatic, and the entry point to southern Germany and to Austria. And you can save about 10 days shipping time if you ship down through Trieste rather than out through Rotterdam going to China. They also now are running the port of Piraeus in Greece. Now, if this was the Cold War and this was the Soviet Union, we would be frantic. But instead we're kind of sleepwalking, thinking, well, gee, I wonder what all this means. And after all, they're not really serious. I mean, as recently as last week, I had somebody who's pretty sophisticated say to me, you really can't think of them as a world power. They may want to be a regional power. And I said, okay, well, the region now extends to a military position in Djibouti, Africa, and it extends into Italy and into Greece. That's a pretty big region. It extends into Venezuela. They also offered, I think, $3 billion to Turkey when we threatened Turkey with sanctions about a month ago. And so what they've been doing is methodically setting themselves up in a very calm way, not particularly hostile, but they're doing this all over the planet in an organized way. The most vivid example of this, and one which I'm involved in and which just drives me crazy, is the rise of the company Huawei and their role in 5G, which is the new much higher speed system, which will define the internet of the next 20 years. Let me ask you, do any of you play or have a device? I think it's called TikTok. How many of you, raise your hand, how many of you have it? Okay. This is very smart on their part. Chinese company, used worldwide, does not mention Tiananmen Square, and does not show you anything about Hong Kong. But it's a worldwide system which they control. So basically, they're getting us to buy for our kids devices to allow them to program them to make sure that they're appropriate, as defined by the Chinese. And you had a good lesson 2 weeks ago with the National Basketball Association about what they mean by appropriate, which is, you tweet the wrong thing, we destroy you. This came as a huge shock. And of course, the billionaire owners of the NBA, in a moment of greed defeating patriotism, promptly said, cave in immediately. Now think about it. This is a China so confident, it is willing to dictate to one of our companies what they're allowed to tweet. And this is the world that's coming. So Huawei gets set up by a former member of the People's Liberation Army, who of course has no relationship anymore to the PLA and is not in any way involved in the military, and becomes the largest telecommunications company in the world. And we don't notice it. I mean, AT&T is basically so heavily in debt that it can't possibly compete. The same thing is true of Verizon. We have no international competitors for Huawei. And our bureaucracies are so messed up between the Federal Communications Commission, the Pentagon, and the Department of Commerce, they can't function. And so over the last 5 or 6 years, you had this momentum building. So Huawei today is in about 50 countries, and I think by the end of next year, it'll be in about 140 countries. And we're just totally out of it. We don't understand the game we're playing. So we're busy playing, if you will, we're playing badminton, and they're playing hockey. And every time they encounter us, they run over us, and we think, that's not very nice. That's not how you play badminton. And they score and go back and get ready to do it again. And this is a very, very serious challenge for us. I'll make 2 points. I wrote the book in part, and I think it's I've written 36 books. And I think it's the most important book I've written. And the reason is, I think the way America works is first you have to have a conversation. And so this book is designed to start a conversation. It took us from 1945 to 1950 to figure out the Cold War. You know, we came out of 1945, we thought of Uncle Joe Stalin. Hollywood made movies that were pro-Russian. They'd helped us beat the Germans. We kind of liked them. They were really going to be all right. And then we gradually in 46, 47, and 48 realized, well, it didn't work that way. And by 50, we have designed the strategy, a document called NSC 68, which basically contained the Soviets until 1991 when they collapsed. But it took even with a generation of leaders who had fought in World War I, spent 20 years studying, and then led World War II, it still took them 5 years. And it's going to take us a while to get used to this, think it through, and understand we're in a competition at the end of which either we will be doing what the Chinese want, or we will be sufficiently strong that the Chinese will in fact, avoid fighting with us and avoid trying to pressure us because we'll be too dangerous. And I believe there'll be no middle ground. Excuse me. I think either we will be so formidable that the Chinese will realize that there are great limits to what they can do, or the Chinese will, in fact, define for us what we're allowed to do in the future, and we will revert to a world in which they're the Middle Kingdom and we are one of the tributary states, which is the model that they have in their head, because that's the model they had for several thousand years. So I think it's very important. But I have an entire chapter in the book making the argument that there's a lot of stuff you can't blame China for. I mean, the fact that our infrastructure is a mess, and that between union work rules and regulatory problems and other things, we can't get our act together to build, I was recently in Japan riding around on a bullet train, and then I got on Amtrak the other day. I mean, it's embarrassing. And we can't get our act together because there's so many local, selfish, greedy interests that we cannot figure out a way to cut through it all and get things done. We have a crisis in education. I mean, people do not understand how deep the crisis in education is. And for most of you, you're not part of it. I mean, you were lucky to go to good enough schools that you could get in here. But I'll give you an example. There are 6 buildings in Baltimore in which not a single student could pass the state math or reading exam. Not one student in 6 buildings. And I've been asking people, if you have a building you spend $30 million on, in which not a single person can pass the exam, what do you call the building? It's not a school, because there's no schooling going on. The people you're paying aren't teachers, because there's no teaching going on. And the young people who are trapped in there aren't students, because none of them are studying. So what language would accurately tell us how bad this is? We don't have any language to discuss this, but it's that bad. I mean, this is the kind of disaster which could end a civilization. You produce a generation that can't read, can't do math, can't get a job, and you're just asking for a nightmare. And so that's not the Chinese fault. That's our fault. And I go through in that particular chapter a whole series of places in which the truth is we have to examine ourselves and how we're going to be competitive and not just blame the Chinese for something. And I think it's a very serious problem. mean, it's not their fault that our Pentagon is now so muscle-bound in bureaucracy that we cannot produce weapon systems inside the cycle of the technology that's available. They become obsolete before you can finish studying it. And so I think we have a lot of challenges. I hope what the book will do is start a serious conversation, first, about the nature of China, and second, about what we have to do, both because of China, but also because of ourselves. Because we want to be a better country than we are right now. We want to do a better job for young people. We want to have a better society. It's not the Chinese fault that there are homeless on the streets in LA and San Francisco. It's not the Chinese fault that there are human feces on the street in San Francisco. I mean, it's not the Chinese fault that the current rules in California guarantee that your largest electric utility has obsolete wires which are starting fires. I mean, these are all, once upon a time we were a very practical country, and we just solved things. Now we're so muscle-bound by lawyers and regulations and red tape that we can't get things done. It's a very, very real crisis, and one which is going to require a huge amount of effort by the next 2 generations, or will gradually decay and will gradually be replaced by a Chinese dictatorship. So I've given you a sweeping overview. I, of course, hope all of you will write an email and whatever technique you use, communicate with everybody you know that they should rush out and buy the book. And I think we are going to take questions, and I think there's supposed to be a microphone somewhere. There it is, it's right there. And you're really clever because you jumped up. I'm very impressed. So anybody who wants to, just get in line. We'll go through as many questions as we can, as fast as we can.
We'll now begin our Q&A. If you would like to ask Mr. Gingrich a question, please exit the door closest to you, and we're actually going to start the line in the lobby, and then they'll feed down through this aisle. And when you come up, please give us your name and keep your question short and concise with no follow-up questions, please.
And you are much better organized than I am. That was very well. That was well done. So having created an elaborate process, do we now have somebody who's going to ask a question? Okay.
Hi, Speaker Gingrich. I really appreciate you coming out here and to USC and creating a conversation that really is not within the bounds of mainstream politics here in the United States right now. And it's a topic that, for me personally, cuts really deep because my parents actually immigrated from Shanghai to the United States in 1998. To escape the terrors of communism. And my grandparents, they grew up and they lived through the Cultural Revolution and the Great Famine that killed 55 million people. And they witnessed how one totalitarian dictatorship could transform a country that had 5,000 years of culture and just proud history to one that would just at instant will follow the words of dictators. And in fact, my aunt personally, she recently disappeared a couple of years ago for speaking at anti-government protest. And my question to you is, I know the Chinese they seem to be advancing and using tactics in negotiating and strategies that we just can't seem to keep up with. And I know that you're close with President Trump, and he talks tough about foreign policy and being tough on China and all that. But given all the human rights violations that the Communist Party of China is committing right now, from the Uyghurs in the West to what's going on in Hong Kong recently, what do you think the U.S. can do right now going forward to help take a stand against this evil farce of a government?
Well, look, I think that's a legitimate question, and I would say that we're in the opening phases of having this conversation and having the confrontation that's coming. I mean, Trump's great achievement was he's the first president to break with the orthodoxy and to actually take the Chinese head on. And I think that happened in part because as a businessman, when he heard President Obama's director of national intelligence say that we were losing between $400 and $500 billion a year in intellectual property theft, just as a businessman, he thought, well, you can't let that go on. So I don't think he started with a comprehensive overview, and I think that he's cautious because I think that his hope is to get a first deal, recognizing it'll be inadequate, and then have to come back again and get a second deal and a third deal. I think the Congress will be more likely to put pressure and to continue raising the issue of human rights. And I think the American strategy should be to reach out to the Chinese people and indicate that we believe everybody in China should have the rights that we think humans are endowed by God with, and that includes the right to belong to a breathing society, the right to speak what you believe, but we should also recognize that that position is a mortal threat to the dictatorship. Okay?
Thank you.
And second, do you have any advice for people like me who are in college and we're struggling to have, I feel like a voice, because a lot of the time we're kind of shut out by professors, and I'm sure a lot of my peers and I'm sure a lot of people here can relate to the fact that there's a tremendous bias, especially for conservatism and people like us, and we're completely shut out. And even if we mention a different political side on a political paper, say in poli-sci or even supporting capitalism and economics, it's ridiculous because we get marked down for the craziest thing. So do you have any advice on that?
I have really bad advice, which you should only do if you really feel in your gut that it's who you have to be. File charges against the professor.
Okay.
And just publicly say, if you, we've had a huge change, for example, in what we tolerate in terms of exploiting people sexually. And we've said the behaviors that 20 years ago were totally acceptable now are totally unacceptable. Well, I think in universities and colleges, we ought to have a similar transition that says professors who abuse their power to impose views that are purely ideological should in fact be fired. And if you have 12 students, the first student may be in trouble. By the 12th student, the professor will be in trouble. And I think we ought to have a culture. Frankly, I think people should tape courses. And I think you should be, and I think when a college says, oh, you can't tape the class, that tells you something about how frightened the college is that the radicalism of its professors will be known. So, but it does take a lot of courage. I mean, look, I always tell people, if you remember the national anthem, the land of the free and the home of the brave. You don't get the free part without the brave part. And that means on occasion you got to take risks. But then I'm a terrible advisor. I've been beaten up my whole career. I mean, and I've just decided that was the price of freedom. Okay?
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Mr. Speaker. My name is Alan Zhang. I came from Northern California. Actually, I interviewed you over the phone yesterday.
Oh.
If you recall my name, my name. So basically, there's two misunderstandings, I think, between American and China. The first one is what you addressed, American leadership and American people with the Chinese leadership, precisely CCP, Chinese Communist Party leadership. I think you addressed it very well. The book, I read 300 pages. I read it in 3 days. Very, very insightful book. I couldn't imagine it was so comprehensive and so much in depth and so revealing. But the second thing I want to ask you is about the misunderstanding between American people and the Chinese people. As a matter of fact, thank you very much for talking about the Falun Gong. I myself is a Falun Gong practitioner. And the principle of Falun Gong is 3 words, as you said, honesty, the first one, truth, compassion, and tolerance. So I came here for graduate study. Then this practice I picked up was brutally persecuted in China. And the Chinese government, not only in other parts of the world, they invade into this country. AM 690 covering Southern California is a Phoenix radio. It's the largest Chinese language radio that occupies this entire market. And our governments are letting them. And we are resisting them. Actually, Chinese people in this country, because we have no other place to run. Okay, we'll have to fight the battle, and we'll have to win over the regime and return China to a really normal country. So my question to you is, have you thought about reaching out to real Chinese people who do not side with the Chinese government regime, who only side with the value of Great America, this country, and the truly traditional Chinese value? So that's my question. Any way or any thought that in that direction?
Yeah, look, I think our basic policy should be to reach out to the Chinese people, to say to the Chinese government, we're quite happy to have a relationship with you, but we are not going to give up on what we believe in because of you. I also think that we ought to establish a government policy that when the Chinese government threatens an American company, that we provide countervailing threats. So if they go after the NBA, it's like a rule in civil damages. We say, we're now going to cost your companies 3 times whatever you cost the NBA. But we're going to protect American companies from a dictatorship capriciously deciding it can impose its values on our companies. The other thing I would say to you is, you ask about leadership, and I think it's very important to distinguish this, okay? The Chinese have, for a great deal of the most recent period, had relatively rational leaders who operated in a collectivity and who were almost all out of an engineering background, rather than being, say, lawyers and the kind of people we tend to produce. And it does give them some advantages. But remember, the most destructive person in the 20th century in human life was Mao Zedong. And I think in the Cultural Revolution, or rather in the Great Leap Forward, I think the estimate was something like 25 million people died. And if you take all the different periods of Mao killing people, he's bigger than Stalin, who was bigger than Hitler. So we spend a great deal of time talking about how horrible Hitler was, and he was. These other two were worse in terms of total number of lives. But we don't talk about that. One of the reasons I think many Chinese are now worried about Xi Jinping is he has violated the rule. They had come out of the period of Mao and they'd figured out you want to have a collective leadership because any one person who gets too powerful can go crazy, which is what had happened to Mao. I mean, Mao's last 15 years were a nightmare. Xi Jinping is now potentially president for life and is breaking out of the collective leadership. I think that frightens even a lot of very senior Chinese, that they don't want to risk going back to a period like Mao had because it was so horrifying. And they lived through it, and they suffered the consequences. Their families suffered the consequences. But I think we should reach out to people. Give us the 4 words again, because I always, it's honesty,
truth, compassion, and tolerance.
And tolerance.
Right.
So remember, that's committing to those 4 words can get you killed in communist China.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My name is Kathy Zhang, came all the way from San Francisco. And first of all, I would really wanted to commend you on, really having such an insight of China, because I came from China. I grew up in China and until, after college. So I was thinking back while I was in college in China, okay? And I went through the Tiananmen Square incidents, although I was in Shanghai, not in Beijing. So when I first came out to the United States, when I saw the video clip of the young man standing in front of the tanks, I was so shocked because it was my first time to see it. Until today, my nephew in Shanghai, they have never seen this clip or picture. They don't know what this is about, a young man standing in front of the tanks. So really, appreciate you bring up this, the importance of understanding of China, understanding Chinese Communist Party. But my question, I have two questions. First question is, so for myself, grew up in China, but I only start to understand about Chinese Communist Party until I arrive here, where there's a free society. But, I understand, Mr. Speaker, you start to study China when you are only a teenager, so it's really impressive. But for the young people, young Americans here, what's your suggestion to them? Why it's so important to understand the real China and distinguishing between the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party? And what's your suggestion how they could understand about that? My first question.
Well, it's a good question. And my cheap answer is they should read my book. But I think if you get a chance to travel to China, you should. I think that it's a remarkable experience. It's an amazing country. And then you should watch carefully and look around. I mean, when you see the number of surveillance cameras, when you talk to people and realize how careful they have to be, I think it gives you a real feel for it. And I think you're right. I also want to pick up something you said and maybe be a little politically incorrect. The Chinese government has worked very hard to eliminate Tiananmen Square from the collective memory of China. For everybody in the country who wants to tear down statues, rename streets, and basically create memory gaps, they should just be very careful, because those are the behaviors of a totalitarian society that erases its past. You may want to re-explain the past, you may want to put in a context for the past, but you start erasing the past and you're going down the road that she just described, where all of a sudden an entire generation knows nothing about it, and that's very dangerous. You have a second question. I don't know if I answered your first one, but go for the second.
Yes, second question is really relates to California, because since we came from communist China, when we see those leftist policies and really see that, when we start to see that, and especially starting with like the statues were pulling down, we saw a cultural revolution. Here in America, probably earlier than other, Americans, since we went through that. I didn't personally went through that, but, we know that. So, but when we talk to people who grew up here, a lot of Americans are very confident about the value of America, which I admire, which I also are, really learning. We think we should. But I think somehow people don't see like, they are already on the road to progressive leftist, but they feel that they have nothing to do with socialism or communism. That's kind of, that's what I observe. I'm not sure it's correct. So I wanted to see, hear from your insights about that.
Well, look, I think actually it's more helpful to talk about what works and what doesn't. The thing that strikes me about California is the degree to which the elites who currently dominate the state are turning it into Venezuela. When I arrived here, and there are 2.4 million Californians with no electricity, and this has been happening on a recurring basis. This is nuts. The essence of the American system is pragmatism. It's actually described by William James as the only uniquely American philosophy. And pragmatism means you figure out what works and do it. And the fact that you can't figure out how to clean out the underbrush, so you have all these huge fires, is pretty stupid. The fact that you can't figure out the kind of regulations which would incentivize the electric company to put in new lines so they aren't starting fires is pretty stupid. And then to sit around wringing their hands and going, oh, these things are just sort of happen to us. No, they don't happen to us. They're the product of a stunningly bad government which has been spending the last 20 years kicking California out of the 21st century and trying to move it back into the 19th. And it's astonishing to me. I love California. I first read about California in 1960. I love visiting. Every time I come here, I get off at LAX. I immediately go to the In-N-Out Burger at the end of the runway. And, and I feel like, what a great place. But I have watched for the last 10 or 15 years as the systems have been grinding down and being dumber and dumber and behaving as though they have no choice. And somewhere between the first really big typhus outbreak, which is going to happen, according to the Center, because you have too many people living on the streets, or the fact that we don't want to use straws because that might hurt the ocean, but the city of San Francisco puts millions of needles into the ocean. Now, it strikes me if I were a fish, I would rather cope with a straw than a needle, but I'm not a fish, so maybe I lack the right perspective. But I think having people, first of all, I think having anybody who's ever lived in a communist system or lived in Venezuela or Nicaragua or Zimbabwe to simply say to their friends, are you nuts? And because to believe in socialism is to be a sign of true ignorance. And I think that's a function of fact. I mean, go look at what happens to countries when they decide to do that, because it transfers power to government. Government is inevitably corrupted, and inevitably that means that the poor get crushed. I mean, if you look at Venezuela, the poor ultimately end up starving, and the handful of people around the government do just fine, which is how the government survives, because it pays off the people who prop it up. So great comments.
Thank you so much. Just allow me, the last comment is, this year is the 70th years anniversary of Chinese Communist Party taking power, right, and the 30th anniversary of the Tiananmen Massacre, and the 20th anniversary of persecution of Falun Gong, which you mentioned. So,
interesting.
Yeah, we know personally how, what the Chinese Communist Party are capable of doing to people. So I just have a, observation, since you're talking about the biggest threat that America is facing is the Chinese Communist Party. And in China, and the Communist Party treat Falun Gong as their biggest threat. So you can see maybe Falun Gong is the best friend of America. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, Mr. Speaker. I have one question. So my name is Spencer. I'm a part of the South Los Angeles Inglewood Republican Assembly. We work here in South LA to try to get more African Americans and minorities and Hispanics, to really, consider, joining the Republican Party and conservative cause. And one of the problems or things that come up is when I talk about socialism and communism, and point to Venezuela and South America and these countries there. Some people tell me, well, those socialism would have worked there if the United States hadn't come in and done some regime change stuff there. So my question to you, Mr. Speaker, is what is the best counter argument to there? What did the United States do in South America, and what is your perspective on that?
It's a great question. Let me tell you the story. A good friend of mine was at dinner at Stanford with Gorbachev after the fall of the Soviet Empire. And Gorbachev was there with a group of faculty members. And one of them said to him, it isn't that communism failed. It's the way you approached it. And if you had approached it correctly, it would have worked. And Gorbachev looked at him and said, you would have to be an American faculty member to believe that. So I would start and say, take a country like Zimbabwe, which we had nothing to do with. Mugabe drove it into the ground, destroyed the quality of life, impoverished people. We weren't there, we weren't doing it. I would also say that as a general rule, look at South Korea and North Korea. I mean, if Americans are so bad, how come if you look at a map at night, you can do this, you can go, all of South Korea is lit up, unlike parts of California. And none of North Korea, except a very tiny area around Pyongyang, is lit up. Now, we didn't do anything to screw up North Korea. And in fact, we have been the ally of South Korea. So how come, if we're the bad guys, the Japanese, the South Koreans, the Germans, the British, the Canadians, lots of people doing okay. And they're doing okay, in the case of South Korea and North Korea, it is a straight contest between capitalism and government-controlled socialism. And government-controlled socialism fails totally. That'd be my advice. But the bigger thing, I think, is to say to them, look, is this really the best we can do? Just look around at your neighborhoods, look around at what's going on in the state, look at the fires, look at the people living on the street. Don't we need some new approach to think about new ways of solving problems? And I wouldn't necessarily fight about ideology. I would fight about pragmatism. Shouldn't we just roll up our sleeves and be practical and fix these things? And isn't it clear that the guys currently in charge can't do it? Because if they could do it, they would have. That's my advice, for whatever it's worth.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, thank you for coming today. My question is, I've heard that China has better technology for combating climate change, and what can we do to better that, or what can we do to catch up?
Well, you know, that's one of the great mythologies. First of all, the Chinese have the largest number of coal-burning electric plants in the world. They have tremendously bad air in terms of pollution. And they are currently, at least up through 2030, they're going to increase the amount of carbon loading that they're putting into the atmosphere. They have invested in, and this is a good example of why we have to be tough. They invested in solar power and in wind power. They went out and bought American companies and basically deliberately tried to drive all their competition out of business. But the truth is, no place in China do wind power and solar power make a major contribution compared to the scale with which they currently use coal. And in fact, doing all this fight about the Paris Treaty and all that stuff, we have consistently gotten better and better. And we're continuing to move in that direction. We're more efficient. The shift from coal to natural gas is a huge advantage in terms of carbon loading. But this also goes back to the fires. Wood that burns and decays increases the carbon loading of the atmosphere. Wood that is growing absorbs carbon. In an ideal world, somebody figured out one day if you planted around 1 trillion trees around the world, you have an enormous uptake of carbon back into forests on a scale that changes almost everything. And so that requires a level of commitment of society. Some places are doing it. South Korea is doing it. Israel's doing it. There's a plan now to actually build a belt along the southern Sahara to stop the desertification. And so there are a lot of practical things that can be done, but I would take very big grain of salt about the idea that the Chinese are dramatically ahead of us in any way in dealing with carbon loading of the atmosphere, which is what people really mean when they talk about climate change.
Thank you.
Okay.
Does America need to function more like a company, more like China, to beat China? Another way, which is more powerful, being a liberal democracy powered by freedom and liberty, or a totalitarian system fighting for the group? Individual or group, which is more powerful?
Oh, in the long run, I think freedom defeats dictatorship every time. Now, that doesn't mean you can sit around, get drunk, do nothing, and say, but I'm free, therefore I'm bound to win. I mean, it means you got to use the intelligence of your freedom. You know, the British Empire should have beaten us in the 1770s. They didn't. You can make a pretty good argument that Kaiser Wilhelm and the German Empire thought they could beat us. They didn't. Hitler had contempt for us, and it turned out he lost. Khrushchev promised to bury us and then disappeared. And there was a brief period in the 1980s when people wrote books about Japan as number one. Mm-hmm. If I had to bet over the next 30 years, this may sound odd, if we don't lose, we will win. And the trick is to understand that the weakness of democracies is that we really don't like to have to do all these hard things if we can avoid it. So it's why Churchill once said, we eventually get around to doing the right thing, we just do it after we've tried everything else. And I think that he lived through that in the 30s, trying to explain Adolf Hitler to a British population that didn't want to hear about it. And ultimately, when they began to rally, they rallied very, very effectively.
But more specifically, if I may,
go ahead.
Do we need to function more like a company where we're operating more like a company on the global stage against a competitor, China company, or do we want to be less of a government presence leading the company and in facilitating our individual private interests to run and do their own thing?
Well, I think the American model has been to use government to create frameworks within which companies compete. Yeah. It was 3 Army Air Corps majors in 1929 who, in their spare time while on active duty, founded Pan American Airlines. And they did it to compete with the Germans in Latin America. It was the Navy recruiting General Sarnoff to create the RCA, Radio Corporation of America, to guarantee that we had the level of investment in the invention of radio, and that made a huge difference in 1919, 1920. You use a computer, which was largely invented with money given by DARPA, the Defense Advanced Research Projects Agency. Literally every part of it. The mouse was invented in a grant, et cetera. You use an internet, which was originally created as ARPANET by the Defense Department, to be a second-level communication system in case of nuclear war. You fly on a jet airplane, which was originally improved by the Air Force buying jet engines, and then transferred over into the private sector. So there's some weird magic to the American system where the government creates a frame of reference and then really aggressive entrepreneurs go out and create wealth. It won't work if you don't have the government help create the frame of reference, and it won't work if you don't leave enough space for the entrepreneurs. And getting that balance right is what has made us, for the last 250 years, an astonishing place. And I think my goal, in part, in writing this book on Trump versus China is to say, you know, if we get our act together as a free people, not imitating the Chinese, and in fact, being free means, as you heard tonight, you get people who come here who are smart, an Australian diplomat said to me, there are many more people in the world who want to join the American club than want to join the Chinese club. Yeah. We want to make sure that remains true, and we want to be strong enough where it matters that the Chinese understand they can never directly challenge us or they would lose. I think that's the goal. And I'm going to say now, because I think I've already run over, I want to thank all of you for a remarkable evening. I really appreciate the opportunity. The quality of the questions have been tremendous. And it's a great privilege to me to be here and to be back on a college campus and to be able to talk about ideas. And we managed to do so without getting into any kind of politics in a way that I think is so refreshing that it makes me want to come back here once a week and just hang out with you guys. Thank you very, very much. Thank you.
So you want your safe space. The last thing you want is somebody invading your campus. You should always feel like you're right.
Freedom is not an abstraction. It affects our happiness and our ability to flourish.
It is very seldom that liberty of any kind is lost all at once. It's always lost bit by bit.
We have protection of freedom of speech. If we said only things that other people liked, we'd have no reason to protect it.
Notice that when Jefferson looks for a source of our rights, can only find one, and that's the Creator.
We are a country that respects religious liberty. That key value has been enshrined in our founding documents.
We are created equal in the eyes of God, the core principle of democracy.
To believe that Islam is a religion of peace is to believe that Muslims throughout history have misunderstood their own religion.
Life is the most fundamental right. None of the other rights that are listed in the Bill of Rights actually exist without first the right to life.
Free markets fundamentally run on service, not to make everyone's outcomes equal. We are diverse people with diverse skills and diverse talents.
Femininity is one of the graces of our world, one of the things that makes life worth living. Feminism has sucked all the joy out of that.
They've attacked manliness itself. They've attacked the virtues. Virtue comes from vir, it means man.
To pretend that a man is a woman, if he believes he is a woman, nobody should be mistreated. But that's not the same thing as requiring that people say objectively untrue things. If I believe I am something that I am not, it does not make me that thing.